If you like this podcast, share it with your friends. You can follow us on social media either on Facebook or on Twitter at cleverramblings. If you have any feedback or comments, please mail us at cleverramblings@gmail.com or visit our website cleverramblings.weebly.com. As always, we really appreciate you listening, and now enjoy today's podcast.
Welcome to the Clever Ramblings podcast. My name is Ivan.
And I'm M.
And today we have our second guest episode. Today we have my former philosophy professor who taught me at the University of Scranton. And we ended up being friends, which is kind of funny considering how different we are in some ways. But today I have Dr. Duane Armitage, professor of philosophy in the University of Scranton. Welcome, Duane.
Thank you.
How are you?
Good.
So it's funny because I remember when I first met you, it was the first class of art and metaphysics, and I remember I was like, oh man, I was like, this guy is gonna be like, I really was skeptical. I was like, this guy is gonna. I didn't have good expectations necessarily, not terrible ones, but I just was like, I don't really know. And then you started talking, and we had conversations, and we realized, we actually have somewhat similar philosophical interests and ideas.
Yeah.
So
I don't know what gave you that impression, but you wrote me a letter for my tenure application, and you put that in the letter. I thought this class was going to be terrible, but it was good.
Well, one thing people know about me, I had to be honest, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So first, let's start. Getting into more of the interview / discussion, because that's how we record our podcast. So first, I know this, but for the audience, tell us a little bit, about yourself. Sort of, what is your background, and really, how did you sort of end up in philosophy?
So as far as my, where I went to school and everything, I went to the New School for my PhD in Manhattan, New School for Social Research, which is related somewhat to the Frankfurt School for Social Research. And then I went to Boston College for a master's degree, and then I did my undergrad at Scranton. That's where I teach now, but I taught at Gonzaga for a little while. It's another Jesuit university on the other coast. And as far as what got me interested in philosophy, I was thinking about this question because people ask it to me all the time, especially students, and I never know how to answer the question. I guess because I've always been interested in philosophy, but I think for me, and this maybe is an unpopular answer, and most philosophers wouldn't say this, for me, philosophy is it sort of has to do with my religious upbringing, I think, and it's a way of answering questions that religion poses, but asking them, from a more rational perspective. So it's about, the methodology with which you approach questions that religion, traditionally deals with. And so Husserl, German Jewish phenomenologist, says philosophy is a way of approaching God without God. And I think a lot of philosophers are obsessed with this question, even if they're atheists. Like someone like Nietzsche is obsessed with God, even though he doesn't believe in God. He's just, so in a lot of ways, philosophy is kind of a cathartic way of dealing with religious questions. And I would certainly say that for myself. So that's my sort of background.
Are you trying to say that religion is not rational?
To some extent it isn't, yeah. I think it has rational components, but I don't think the religious impulse is at least first rational. I think it's mostly unconscious or subconscious, whatever you want to call it. And when people work on it, they can make it intelligible. So I don't think religion is unintelligible or irrational, but I don't think the impulse that drives it for most people is rational. So I'm with Kierkegaard on this one.
So what is your research area, right? I mean, I know that you deal with sort of, you have a wide range of interests, but if someone said, okay, well, what is your field? What would you say it is?
Well, what I put down on my CV is something like 20th century continental philosophy, specialization in Heidegger. But I've published on a lot of different stuff, mainly German philosophy, what's considered continental philosophy now. But Heidegger is my main research focus. But I also do research on Kierkegaard to some extent, Nietzsche a little bit, and Kant, and philosophy of religion. So it spreads out. Right now, I'm really interested in postmodernism, and I'm thinking about that more. But that's generally speaking German philosophy, but with emphasis on Heidegger from the continental tradition, not the analytic tradition.
Why German? Do you think there's something special about German philosophy? I mean, I know this makes M happy. M's like, I love he loves German stuff.
Well, the Germans, I think the Germans really dominated philosophy, I would say, in the last, I don't know, since Kant, really. And you really can't do philosophy without reading the Germans. And I've read the history of philosophy, but then when I got to the Germans, I got stuck there because they're so systematic and they're so long-winded, but they're so clear in a way that I never got out of them. But I think 20th century philosophy, or at least where we are now, at least in the way we think, are now in our, postmodernism, for example, I think dominates the culture of the West, at least in America. I don't know what it's like in England, but I think that's due in part, or in a large part, to Nietzsche and Heidegger. So, but then also too, I think there's not as much secondary literature on the Germans because they're newer than, for example, something like Plato and Aristotle, which, to write a dissertation on Plato and Aristotle was just, a lot of work. And so I was also cutting corners a little bit by choosing Heidegger because he's within the last 100 years. But it's mainly interest that drives me to the Germans.
So why the shift in focus to postmodernism? Do you think that like, for example, maybe Nietzsche may have sort of thrusted you in some way towards that? Because I can see how we studied in your class with Nietzsche, how that can lead to a sort of postmodern thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Nietzsche is most responsible for postmodernism. He's the one thinker that's most responsible for it, but he doesn't get thrown in with postmodernism, strangely. And by the way, just as far as definition-wise, postmodernism is used in a lot of different ways, especially now. It's sort of creeped into, I don't know what it's like, again, in England in terms of politics, but you hear it all the time in political discourses now, or when people are reflecting on political discourses. But as far as a definition of postmodernism, by that I just simply mean anything that begins with a critique of rationality, or particularly a critique of truth, or skepticism toward truth. So you could even throw Kant in as a kind of proto-postmodernism, but I think you're right, Ivan, that Nietzsche is really the source of the whole thing, because we read with this the essay that was published posthumously on Truth and Lie in the Extramoral Sense with Nietzsche, where he sort of begins from this perspective that the mind and the intellect can't be trusted, and that it's sort of a lie factory and it constructs reality. And this is really what the postmoderns really ran with. So really what postmodernism is, it's the French reception of German thinking, particularly the thinking of Nietzsche and Heidegger and these guys. But I think also too what interests me in postmodernism is, again, especially now after, I'd say 2014, with the election of Donald Trump, American politics, I think particularly the left is using postmodernism in interesting ways. So, yeah.
I think the right is too, with the whole fake news.
That's right. That's exactly right.
They're also, I think it's a whole bunch of, you can't, like the whole alternative facts thing, which of course was like so stupid, but like, it's being used as like, you can't really know anything. And I mean, I guess me, you and M know, like in a very practical way. Yeah, we know, like we know that we something me and you have talked about a lot is like absolute truth, right? Can we actually attain absolute truth? Mm-hmm. And we don't know. At least science says that we can't really, that we can never prove anything. And so, but again, practically, you have to sort of have facts and believe in something.
Right.
And I think that's what the right and the left is kind of tearing away, to get everyone as confused as possible. Particularly the right, I think, is trying to get people confused. I think the left is just confused. they don't understand how Trump won. And they just don't know what to do.
Well, I think Trump won. It was interesting. I think you're exactly right. I think postmodernism is largely a left, or at least it was received very well by the Marxists in Europe and particularly in France. But yeah, it's typically associated with the left. But you're absolutely right that it's been appropriated by the right, at least in America, with the idea of questioning facts and truth and making everything into a perspective. Very interesting. But I think that's largely a response to the left. But the left introduced it. So, they're just trying to I think they're winning at the left's game, if that makes sense.
Right,
game of postmodern. Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
So back to somewhat specifically Scranton.
Yeah.
So my own, I remember you brought up a very interesting point. And this will be my last question for a while, so that M gets to ask his questions. I remember you told us one time, or I think it was in our SJLA class, which was a honors program, special Jesuit liberal arts. It was a philosophy based, really focused honors, liberal arts honors program, but we took mainly like philosophy courses. And so I think you told our class, or you told me when I went to your office, that basically everyone's sort of like, after you study philosophy for a little while, you kind of fall into really one of two camps at least when it comes to, I think, truth, right? And you said it was either Plato or Nietzsche, which I thought was very interesting, because I thought about it. I said, yeah, like most of the positions that people take sort of fall into one of those two camps. So but can you explain why you think that's, because I think you're right, but I just want to, can you explain what led you to that conclusion?
Yeah, I think it's an unpopular position, apparently. I wrote a book about this, and people, when it was getting reviewed and these other things, or when it was getting peer reviewed, people were really upset with me just trying to make everything into these two positions. But I get the idea from Heidegger. Heidegger thinks there is one position in the history of metaphysics, which is Plato and also Nietzsche. They're the same. He just thinks Nietzsche inverts Plato. I disagree with Heidegger there. I think there are actually two positions, Plato and Nietzsche, as you said. And I'm glad you remember that too, because that in a sense is the point of that course. It's really simple, actually, if you think about it. Either you're a realist or you're an anti-realist. Either you think the world is intelligible and the mind can sort of map onto that, or you think that the mind constructs reality, which is what Nietzsche thinks for the most part. So it's not really a controversial position, but it's sort of like saying, and from that position you can say, well, either you're a theist or an atheist. Either you think the world has objective meaning, or the mind is imposing meaning. It's very simple. I mean, and for example, you said Plato and Nietzsche. I would put Aristotle, and I'm not the first to think of this, that Aristotle is just a sort of form of Platonism. The Neoplatonists thought that to some extent. There's a book, I forget the guy's name, but it's a really good book. I'd recommend it. It's called Aristotle and Other Platonists. And he shows that, if you read the Metaphysics, Aristotle ends up, trying to distinguish himself from Plato in the very beginning. But toward the end, in Book Lambda, it's all about why there's, what being is. Metaphysics is about being qua being. But the book in the end is about metaphysical realities, and he almost sounds just like a Platonist. And then on the other end of that spectrum, I would put Kant. You might be able to put Kant as a kind of skeptic about those two positions, but either the mind knows reality or it doesn't, and Kant doesn't. Kant kind of wavers on that, but I would put him in, as I said earlier, as a proto-postmodernist and a kind of Nietzschean in a way, and then Heidegger thinks that too. These aren't really. So what I'm saying here isn't really controversial positions. It's just the way I'm sort of putting it. But I think it's kind of commonsensical to say that those are the two positions you can take: realist or anti-realism, Plato or Nietzsche. Yeah.
Which one are you?
I'm a Platonist.
And what are you? Do you believe that the universe is intelligible, or are you more of an anti-realist?
I'm more on the side of Plato here, yeah.
And why would you say? Do you have is it because of science, or?
Kind of, yeah. That's my field. That's where I get my view of the world from. So yeah, I would go with that.
I think, especially with science, I mean, it's really difficult if you're a mathematician. Most mathematicians, and I know there are philosophers of mathematics, but they're different from mathematicians. Most mathematicians, if you talk to them, they're Platonists. They're dealing. Mathematics, in my opinion, is a metaphysical science. And in a way, you're not dealing with empirical realities. And that's the big problem. I mean, Platonism started from a kind of, an interest in mathematics with his, Plato's, dealings with the Pythagoreans and things like this. But for me, and this was the problem for Nietzsche too. What do you do with mathematics? Because mathematics is the language of science. And is it just a construct? If it's a construct, why does it work so well? Analytic philosophers talk about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. And it just seems to me you're dealing with realities that are outside of both the physical world and our mind. And then, mathematics does it for me. That puts me on the side of Plato, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think me. I mean, you know me. I'm kind of both in a way. I try to. I don't necessarily think that realism and anti-realism are necessarily mutually exclusive. The reason I say that, I mean, because for example, I'm a realist because, like Em said, right, we're scientists, right, and so in a very practical sense, I'm not going to try to understand something that I think by definition cannot be understood, right? Or else I think I would lose motivation, right? I think in science or in any type of really scholarship where you think there's an answer to something and you're motivated. If I told you, if you started from the position like, oh, we'll never figure that out, then you would, and you probably would never really, you wouldn't be able to get out of bed to do it all the time, right? The same with why I think like a lot of our science questions, right? You see this when we really need like the brain initiative or like these trying to map like the entire neural connections in your brain, right? It's going to take a long time, right? Possibly. And there may need to be other science projects, like for example, things with string theory or something that you can build towards, but you'll never be able to answer the question within your lifetime, which I think prevents a lot of it from happening because a lot of scientists are like, well why would I spend, like they feel like for them the answer is out of like it's beyond them, and so they rather sort of answer smaller questions that they think they can actually figure out.
You mean the answer about whether the world's intelligible or not, or that's why scientists don't think about that? Or are you talking about something, or others just in general problems that don't seem to lend themselves to answers? Is that what you're saying?
Right. That's what I mean. Like in a way, you believe it could be understood, and in a very practical sense, you believe that you can understand it, right? So we have to work. So we work on problems in that way that we believe we can solve. Now, where my anti-realist comes in is like as far as absolute truth, and I think I've talked to you about this before. Do I believe that we will ever attain absolute truth? Which, to me, absolute truth is truth that cannot be questioned, right? And so I always think somewhat in a weird way that the truest things that we think about, I mean, the truest things in the world are the things we cannot question. Like they're so intuitive and they work that we can't, it's beyond our ability to doubt, right? So I don't believe that we'll ever attain absolute truth, but I do believe it's there. So that's why that's the Plato sort of in me, but the sort of anti-realist is like, in practical terms, we really won't. But as far as for science, it's kind of the opposite. I'm like, well, we can answer these questions, but I just know that we may not. We'll get close enough to do certain things that satisfy me, right? We may not know exactly how the brain's going to work, but we can get close enough that we can help people with diseases or learning difficulties, right? So that's how I sort of use both.
Well, but you said absolute truth is truth that can't be. I do think in some ways there are truths that we can't doubt. I don't know if they're absolute truths, but I think, and this is partly why I'm interested in postmodernism. You put it in a nice way. I think logical truths or even you could say mathematical truths, but truths that condition reason, that without which you can't reason, I think are undoubtable in a certain sense. This is where I think Nietzsche Nietzsche was aware of this. I think, you start calling into question the truths of rationality. You have to use rationality to do so, and I think that makes them in a really fundamental sense, absolute truths in a sense that I think once you start questioning rationality, you use rationality to question rationality, and you wind up in either unintelligibility or with truths that cannot be doubted. This is sort of the backbone to Descartes' critique, that he's finding something that he can't do away with without using it, and so in a very real sense, I think logical and mathematical truths are absolute. And if you see me on the video, I'm not on video, but I put them in air quotes. But I do think they're not able to be questioned as easily, at least, as people think they are. And I think that's where postmodernism. Maybe it's a side tangent, but I certainly agree with you that obviously there's a point to the anti-realist or the social constructionist idea of reality. A lot of reality is, the mind does bend reality. There's not maybe a one-to-one correspondence, but I think at the end of the day, you have to make a choice whether you think the world is intelligible or not, or whether you're what you're doing in science is actually getting at the way the world is, or you're just controlling reality.
So what did you have, him?
So I would say with the current dominance of science and technology as we have it nowadays, where do you think philosophy fits in? Because I'm also guilty of that. There are fascinating topics in philosophy, but science and technology, like, it makes progress. It's applicable in the real world. Where do you think philosophy fits in there?
Yeah. Okay, this is a great question. I think it depends on, what the status of what philosophy deals with is. I mean, when you talk about progress in science and technology, what's meant by progress? And I think what people mean when they say progress, or if you push them on it, or how do you measure progress? I think what they mean is how much you could control, or how much technological progress is used, or how much technology is advancing based on the theory. So I think philosophy in general doesn't lend itself to the technological. So it doesn't make progress in that sense. It's not like, Heidegger wrote Being in Time, and then all of a sudden we had great technology from it. The way you measure philosophy, it's very, it doesn't have a measuring rod like science does. Science comes up with a new paradigm, and there's all these different things that, people are working out with theory. And so, philosophy is purely, I don't want to say purely speculative, but it's an end in itself. It doesn't have any, it's not a means to anything else, at least at its core. And so, and this brings you to the second point, that when you say, what's the place of philosophy in, or relative to the current dominance of science and technology, I think it depends on what the status of the metaphysical is. I think philosophy ultimately deals with the metaphysical. If it doesn't, or if there is no metaphysical, then science and technology are all that's worth it. I mean, really, you can give up philosophy. It's a waste of time. But saying philosophy is a waste of time, I think, presupposes a radical kind of reductionism of, that reality just is the physical, or it's just the empirical. And it's, metaphysical questions like questions of meaning, questions of ethics, questions of even what science is. That's a sort of non-scientific question. If you're asking about science, you're not doing science anymore. You're doing philosophy in a sense. But I think you'd have to say those questions are all worthless if you can't have knowledge that's beyond the physical, or if you can't have knowledge that's, meta-empirical, and knowledge is limited, or science is limited, science is limited simply to the empirical. So I think it's a question of what progress is first, and then, the status, or the ontological status of the metaphysical. And in a certain sense, you could say that philosophy, in a way, deals with the axiomatic, if you want to put it that way, that it's dealing with things that have to be, sort of presupposed, or that can't be, you can't get a strictly scientific or empirical answer for these things. This is the problem. So I think a lot of the debate between scientists and philosophers, they get out of right out of the gate, they have different axioms. And so the scientists tend to be reductionists, and they just assume whatever the philosopher's talking about goes nowhere, because they've limited the nature and scope of what reason can tell us, or what kind of truths they're willing to accept.
I think, because I was just wondered, I think it was good what you said about, the different types of sort of progress, right? It's not going to make technological progress.
Right.
I think sometimes I wonder if it makes progress within itself. Not because I get that it's not necessarily dealing with different types of different realms, right? But the meta-empirical, or the sort of metaphysical realm, is by definition it's not really tangible, right? And it's not very easy to discuss. And I think for that reason, I think progress in a lot of ways is a lot more difficult in philosophy than it would be in science. Because in science, yes, we really, a lot of things that we need now are sort of methods, right? So for the brain, we need better ways to image the brain, right? Because the way that we image the brain, even though it's good, right, it has a lot of drawbacks, no matter which sort of technique you use. Same with M's field, right? Genetics. I mean, it's a developing field, right? But I think the breakthroughs are going to come in the way that you measure genetics and the way you that's going to be where progress. Of course, you have theoretical progress, right? But then that's more of a more direct route, like doing math models and all these type of stuff. But I think with philosophy, I think sort of at every step, you're dealing with something that is very nebulous already. It's very vague.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean there is progress in philosophy in a sense. I mean, if you look at we were talking earlier about the Germans and phenomenology and Husserl and Heidegger. I mean, that's significant progress in my estimation to philosophy. I mean, they basically what Husserl figured out and then Heidegger is there's a whole other realm of philosophical analysis or for philosophical analysis that was ignored. So there is progress in philosophy, but you're right. It does have to do with, I think, technology to a lot. Heidegger says science is just basically technology. I mean, maybe you don't want to go that far, but I think he thinks science is simply technology. And he makes good arguments for it.
Do you ever wish, M, that you were a philosopher instead of a scientist?
Not really, no. I find science so fascinating because I have something there that I can observe. I like to talk about like philosophy, and there are, like I said, interesting topics, but I want to have something in front of me that I can observe and then see the results, interpret the results, and then I get my desired results or not. But we can talk about that forever and ever in philosophy and don't get anywhere, or maybe we make some progress. But with science, I have my thing, and then either it worked or it didn't work. My hypothesis is correct or not correct, and I can move on. I need this like closure.
Yeah, but see, really, the like what you just said, really the ultimate standard is whether it works or not, or whether you can predict or control, and that I think makes it technological in a sense, if that makes sense. In that sense of getting a grip on something and moving and controlling something. So I think science is inextricably bound to technology, or at least modern science, modern empirical science.
Yeah, because without new tools, we can't really answer anything. That's the same thing I was saying about the brain. Without right now, we are really. I mean, you can argue that it's been that way since science started. That we are to make progress, but definitely moving forward, we're going to need to fuse science and technology. That's why I think it's good that we say science and technology, right? So I think you're definitely right about that.
This question of anti-realism and realism comes up in this debate between, what's the nature of science and technology and their relationship. And there are many people, particularly philosophers, but a lot of scientists too, who are just saying, well, look, science is simply an instrument. It's a tool. It doesn't tell us anything about reality. It just controls. And the paradigms get better and better. This is like Thomas Kuhn, right? There's paradigm shifts. I think you've read that book, right? That really science doesn't tell us anything about the world. But it comes back to this question: to what extent science is actually giving us knowledge of anything, or if it's just controlling things. And I think that's another postmodern assumption, that science doesn't tell us anything about the world. It's just an instrument for control, for will to power in the Nietzschean sense. I just wanted to add that.
Okay. One concept that I've always found interesting, I think this kind of comes off of what we were saying about progress and it being about different realms, right? Is that it was popularized by E.O. Wilson, but I think it's the concept of consilience or the unification of knowledge. But I think he actually said of course it has its roots in, I think, the Enlightenment or so somewhere like sometime, but he made it popular in his book Consilience. Considering it, say, philosophy and science and other things, like say even if you think of sciences and the humanities or anything like that, do you believe in consilience or the unification, that we can ever have a unified framework for knowledge that includes all of these? And I would ask these to you and M, because I'm very interested to see like what, because I have my own opinion, but I want to know what both of you think.
I'm familiar with the E.O. Wilson book, but I think he's talking there particularly now, and correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't read it, but I've read about it. I've read a little bit of E.O. Wilson. He sort of hung up on this idea of what's the place of the humanities vis-a-vis the sciences. But my answer to the question is yes, absolutely. I believe in this. And this goes all the way back to, Kant, who says that, if you're even doing science, or if you're looking for knowledge in general, and you don't think that you're ever going to find it, and that includes, a unified theory or whatever the theory of everything, I think it, it destroys the endeavor itself. So I think you have to have it, at least for Kant, he says, as a necessary regulative function or a necessary heuristic to get science or to get even the pursuit of truth in general off the ground. You have to want, I think the idea that the world's going to ultimately make sense in some coherent manner, I think. So, yes, I believe in this, and I have to hope for it. And I think it does come back. I think if you're against it, I think it comes back, and I'm like a broken record here about, the Plato and Nietzsche thing. I think if you think the world's intelligible, ultimately, then you can discover how it's ultimately connected. Now, that maybe there's a limit epistemologically on the human being that he can't or she can't get the whole thing together, but I think you have to hope for that. On the other hand, in the E.O. Wilson sense about can there be can the sciences and the humanities, talk to each other? Yes. But I do think fundamentally the humanities deal with different aspects of reality, where science, but it's the same reality in a sense. So I do believe in this, absolutely, or I hope for it at least.
What about you, Em?
I would hope for it too, but I'm not sure if we ever gonna achieve that. Like, I think humans are not capable of answering or seeing the whole picture. I think our mind is not constructed for that. And I think there is a limit that we can't go past. And I don't know if we gonna we talked about our last interview about AI. Maybe AI in the future can do that, but is AI then interested in that? Is it interested in concepting the whole picture, or can we program it to be interested in that? So I find it very interesting and to think about if we can ever achieve it, but I'm not sure that we can achieve that. I also hope for it because that's one of the most important question, that everything fits together and makes sense, why we are here, and all comes into place, and we know how everything fits together. But I'm not sure with our capabilities if we are ever able to do that.
Yeah. I was just going to add, Ivan, you've heard me bring this up before, Heisenberg's book on philosophy and physics. He basically says what Em says, that, look, it may all fit together, but our mind is incapable. I mean, once we get to the quantum world, where we cannot think outside of classical categories, Newtonian categories, and so we're never going to understand the way, even what the advances of physics or science tells us, we're never going to understand them. We'll just be able to, we'll have math and they'll work, but we'll never understand them. And, but that's an epistemological problem, not a ontological problem. But I just wanted to add that to M's point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in my opinion, I think there is a framework, and I think, again, like what Em said, is our minds aren't sort of constructed. The sort of arrogance that we have, that we think we're going to be able to understand everything, I think is like really funny when you think about it, right? Because if you just think of what it would take to understand, like, I mean, of course, I keep using this example because I'm a neuroscientist, but the brain, right? You have billions of neurons, trillions of connections. Then it's influenced by, we found out, like, it has a lot of links to, like, your gut, right? Your microbiome. And then it's influenced by the environment. It's like, for us to have like a unified theory of, say, even the brain, like, that would be, I don't even think we could really necessarily do that, right? And so, of course, my solution is, which I'm pretty sure Duane is going to roll his eyes, is that is transhumanism. We've mentioned transhumanism on the podcast multiple times, but I think the best way is for us to augment ourselves and augment our minds. I think that's really if we want to be the ones to discover it or create AI or something like that. But I'm saying I think it can't be done by us. I think that's, and I've come to that realization a long time ago. It was really sad because I was like, man, I'll never be able to understand everything. That kind of sucks. I definitely think it's true. That we won't be able to.
I think we're just not constructed for that. We are constructed by evolution, and evolution just said to us, like, survive in the environment you are and procrastinate, but not answer deep questions. So I don't think that our brains are constructed for that. And yeah.
You really hate transhumanism, don't you, Duane?
I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of AI too. I don't think AI is ever going to go anywhere. I think it's a complete waste of time. I mean, real AI. I mean, strong AI. I mean, we'll have like advanced series that can pose like human beings. We'll never be able to recreate a human brain, I don't think, or a human mind.
Duane actually, we created a class called on transhumanism.
Yeah.
And I felt like he agreed only because I asked and he didn't really like want to say no, but it was like I would say like what I've read and stuff like that, and he would sort of cringe every time that I would mention something about transhumanism until I did convince him. One day I convinced you of transhumanism, but you won't admit it.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, of course you don't. Yeah.
Then he must have drugged me or something. I don't remember.
Yeah, there was this one time he's like Kent, that makes perfect sense. Like you got it and whatever. And then I went to go tell everyone else in SJLA, and he's like, oh no, like, and he didn't want to just sort of downplay and shrug it off. But I know that day you saw the light, and it was great to see.
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, augmenting the human body, we do that already to some extent, but I don't know, there might be a qualitative change after all the quantitative changes. I mean, I don't know. It depends what you mean by transhumanism. It's a whole other discussion, but. Yeah.
All right, Em. You want to ask the biggest? Well, it's the last question, but I think it might be the biggest. Maybe, I don't know. Depends on whatever. Ask. What's the last question, Em?
Yeah. So, do you think then philosophy is an art, a science, or is it neither?
That's a good question. I think it's a science in the sense of, depends on what you mean by science. Scientia just means knowledge. It's Latin from the Greek episteme. I think if philosophy deals with truth, then it's a science. It's just a non-empirical science. So the term science has been conflated simply with empirical science and modern science. But I think philosophy is a science. I think logic is a science. I think math is a science. I think they're non-empirical sciences. But I think philosophy is a science. It's just not an empirical, or it's not scientific in the modern sense. It doesn't use the hypothetical deductive method. But it's a science. I think it yields truth. And if it yields truth, I think it's a science. Art, you could say, yields truth too. But not in the same way. And art is much more subjective. It's much more emotional. Now, philosophy has that component to it. It has, it uses rhetoric. It has artistic license and certain things. But I think at the end of the day, philosophy yields knowledge, and then it's a science.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny. I actually one time I had drinks with a friend, and she was basically saying, sort of say like, the whole non-empirical science, because she's saying she studies, but like poetry, I think, and literature. And so she was saying that she was at this conference about how it was basically like it was saying that they have methodological approaches that can be used that they consider as science. And I think, and I've thought about this a little bit, that I'm not, and in discussion with her and in hearing you say that, I'm not opposed, because like you said, if it's scientia, right, we've sort of made science, right, which was originally called, natural philosophy, right, and so we've sort of boxed science in, so we've sort of narrowed our definition of what science is through the years to only include empirical stuff. And so I'm definitely not opposed to calling something like philosophy science, or having having non-empirical sciences. I think the only thing that I caution against that is that again, we want to have a unified framework, but I think sometimes that one steps into the other a little bit too much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is somewhat good to distinguish, right? Because if I'm like, you have to look at all parts, together. But I think, again, science is about things that work, right? Whereas philosophy is not necessarily about that, or other humanities is not necessarily about that. So I think so I think it could be included, but I think there should also be clear sort of distinction and know what you're talking about. Like, what type of science are you doing?
Yeah, and just to add to that, you have the reverse going on a lot too. Not just that philosophers are delving into science, but scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson, all these popular scientists are often doing philosophy, or at least speaking in non-scientific ways about things they Noam Chomsky with politics, Richard Dawkins, all these guys are talking about Stephen Hawking. They're all talking about philosophical inferences that they're drawing from the science, and really they're speaking in non-scientific ways. So there's not a clear distinction between, that it's not as if there's empirical knowledge over here and then philosophical knowledge over here, and they never touch. I mean, scientists are constantly, trying to put a philosophical worldview together from their scientific research. So there's always, mixing, I think.
What do you think, Em? Would you be okay with having philosophy count as a science?
I don't. I'm biased in that kind because I told you what my concept of science is, so philosophy doesn't really fit in that. But I can also see part being scientific. I would have to think about that one. I'm not sure.
And put it this way, I would say, like I think I said this earlier a little bit. Science or philosophy deals with what's axiomatic, but once the axioms are chosen, or if you will, you can deduce and draw a lot from those things. But there's certain things that you can't prove an axiom. It's either assumed or it's not. But philosophy deals with what axioms are right, what axioms are wrong, and it makes arguments for them. Now you can't have scientific arguments for them because they're axioms. You start from there, but you can make cases in the same way I think a lawyer would make a case in a courtroom or something. You can make cases for certain things that are rational and intelligible. It's just that you can't ever, or maybe ever, prove them. But I think you can go a long way if you figure out what your axioms are.
I guess with that, we'll. I mean, this is fun. I mean, I haven't really been. M is not as you've seen, is not the he likes talking about, like, me and him will have philosophical conversations all the time. But it's not something that he's gonna be enthusiastic about studying. So
and go in that much depth.
Right. Whereas me, I love that shit. So it's been very refreshing, having this sort of conversation. We should talk more often. It's but I know that I kind of go ghost on people, so it's kind of that's kind of how it is. I say I'll message you. I actually just Skyped with another professor last week, and I was like, man, I haven't talked to you in 6 months, 6 months or something. And it was just, he emailed me and said, oh, hi, how are you doing? I was like, yeah, I guess they might want to check in every now and then to know I'm not dead. So yeah, this has been very refreshing, and I think hopefully, especially the SJLA people, hopefully will appreciate this episode, and yeah, we should talk more philosophy sometime.
Yeah, anytime you want. I'm always here.
Yeah, I know. That's the fun part about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
All right. No problem. Thank you for coming on.